Hello everyone, and I wish you all a wonderful day. Today we will explore Trieu Dung's journey deep into the wet mountain forest to search for wild bananas. After crossing slippery slopes, thick vines, and muddy trails, he discovers a heavy bunch of bananas hanging low in the deep forest. But cutting it down is only the beginning. The real challenge is bringing it home before darkness falls. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. As soon as the morning light touched the mountains, Trieu Dung woke up and prepared for another hard day in the forest. He did not spend much time around the house. There was no long rest and no slow morning routine. He checked the knife, lifted the bamboo basket onto his back, tightened the strap, and stepped toward the trail. The air was still cold from the night rain. The path ahead looked wet, narrow, and quiet. Trieu Dung knew a day like this would not be easy, but the forest might offer something useful if he went deep enough. Wild bananas often grew in damp places, hidden behind thick leaves and tall grass. If he found a good bunch, the journey would be worth it. With the knife in his hand and the basket pressed against his back, he entered the forest. At first, the path was only slightly muddy. Fallen leaves covered the ground, and drops of water slipped from the branches whenever the wind moved. Trieu Dung walked carefully, keeping his eyes on each step. Under the leaves, there could be stones, roots, or soft holes filled with mud. He used the knife to push away branches and cut through vines blocking the way. The deeper he went, the thicker the forest became. The sound of the village faded behind him, replaced by insects, birds, and the quiet drip of rainwater from the high leaves. Tall grass brushed against his legs. Wet bushes leaned into the trail. Sometime the path disappeared, and he had to choose his own direction by following the slope between trees. Soon the ground became steeper. The rain had turned the hillside into a slippery climb. Trieu Dung leaned forward and held tree trunks while carrying the knife. The bamboo basket bumped against his back each time his foot slid in the mud. He stopped, took a deep breath, and looked up at the green wall of trees ahead. There was still a long way to go. He continued slowly, not because he was weak, but because he understood the forest. A careless step could twist an ankle. A loose stone could send him sliding down the hill, so he moved with patience, cutting only what he needed to cut and saving his strength. After crossing a wet patch of low ground, he noticed several wide banana leaves beyond a cluster of bushes. They were tall, torn by wind, and darker than the smaller plants around them. Trieu Dung paused and listened. The place was quiet. Then he stepped closer, using the knife to open a path through the grass. As he pushed past the leaves, he saw banana plants growing near the slope. Some were young, some were broken, but one plant stood heavier than the rest. Its trunk leaned forward, and beneath the large leaves, a thick bunch of wild bananas hung low. Trieu Dung stopped and looked at it carefully. The bunch was big, packed with many small bananas pressed tightly together. It was not the clean, perfect kind people saw in the market. These bananas were rough, wild, and uneven, but they looked strong and full. After the difficult climb through mud and vines, this was exactly what he had come to find. He set the bamboo basket down beside a tree and moved closer to the banana plant. Before cutting anything, he checked the ground around the base. The slope was slippery, and thick grass covered the roots. If the bunch fell the wrong way, it could break apart or roll down the hill. He began clearing the base with steady movements. The knife cut through wet grass, soft stems, and thin vines wrapped around the trunk. Piece by piece, the ground became more open. His clothes were damp, his hands were muddy, but his eyes stayed focused on the heavy bunch above him. When the base was clear, Trieu Dung stepped back and studied the plant one more time. He looked at the leaning trunk, the direction of the slope, and the weight of the bananas. Then he planted his feet firmly in the mud, raised the knife, and prepared to bring the wild banana bunch down. Trieu Dung brought the knife down against the banana trunk with firm, careful cuts. The trunk was not hard like old wood, but it was thick, wet, and heavy with water. Each strike made a dull sound in the quiet forest. Pale sap ran from the cut, and the broad leaves above him trembled. He did not rush. He watched the bunch carefully, making sure it would fall toward the open ground he had just cleared. After several cuts, the banana plant began to lean. Trieu Dung stepped to the side, pushed the trunk gently with one hand, and gave it one more strong cut near the base. The plant cracked, bent forward, and came down with a wet thud. The heavy bunch landed safely on the grass. Trieu Dung breathed out slowly. None of the bananas had rolled down the slope, and the bunch had not broken against the stones. He crouched beside it and checked the fruit with his hands. The bananas were small, rough, and tightly packed together, but the bunch was full and heavy. Some fruits were still green, while a few showed a faint yellow color. He used the knife to cut the bunch away from the fallen trunk. The stem was thick, so he had to work from both sides. Sap covered his fingers, and pieces of wet fiber stuck to the blade. When the bunch finally came free, he trimmed away torn leaves and extra stem to make it easier to carry. For a short moment, he sat on a low root and looked around. The forest had become quieter than before. The light above the trees was softer, and the air felt colder. In the mountains, evening could arrive quickly. If he stayed too long, the muddy trail would become dangerous in the dark. So Trieu Dung stood up and prepared the load. He dragged the banana bunch toward the bamboo basket. It was too large to fit neatly inside, so he placed the thick stem downward and let part of the fruit rest above the rim. Then he took a rope and tied the bunch tightly to the basket frame. He pulled the knot hard, shook the basket once, and checked that the fruit would not slip out. Lifting the basket was difficult. Trieu Dung bent his knees, slipped his arms through the straps, and pushed himself up. The weight pressed heavily onto his shoulders. For a few seconds he stood still, trying to balance. The banana bunch pulled him backward, and the mud beneath his feet made the first steps uncertain. But he tightened the strap across his chest and began the return journey. Going back felt even harder than going in. The path was slippery, narrow, and covered with wet leaves. With the heavy basket on his back, every step had to be careful. He walked sideways on the steep parts and held tree trunks whenever the mud started to slide under his feet. Sometimes he used the knife like a walking stick. The forest slowly grew darker. Birds called from high branches, and insects became louder in the grass. His shirt clung to his back. His shoulders ached, and his legs felt tired from the long climb. Every time the banana bunch shifted, he leaned forward and adjusted his balance. At one narrow section, the trail dropped sharply beside a line of rocks. Trieu Dung stopped before crossing. He looked at the mud, chose the side near the trees, and moved one step at a time. The basket scraped against a branch, but the rope held firm. He passed the difficult part without losing the load. By the time he reached lower ground, the light had turned weak and golden. The way ahead was still wet, but it was more familiar now. Trieu Dung kept walking, tired yet satisfied. The wild bananas on his back were proof of the day's effort. When he finally came out of the forest, the sky was close to evening. He carried the heavy bunch toward home before darkness covered the path completely. His steps were slow, his body was worn out, but he had returned with what he went searching for. In this episode, Trieu Dung wakes up early and heads straight into the wet mountain forest with a knife and a bamboo basket on his back. The trail is muddy, slippery, and covered with fallen leaves, forcing him to move slowly through thick vines, tall grass, and steep slopes. After a long climb, he discovers a wild banana plant bending under the weight of a large bunch. Before cutting it down, he carefully clears the base and studies the ground so the bananas will not break or roll away. With steady cuts, he brings the plant down safely, trims the bunch, and ties it tightly to his basket. As evening approaches, he carries the heavy load back through the darkening forest, tired but satisfied with the hard-earned harvest. It becomes a simple story of patience, strength, and forest survival today.